Good day. Yesterday and over the last couple of days, I've been talking about the fact that despite all indications that the situation in Bakhmut has become irretrievable and unsustainable for Ukraine, Ukraine seems to be intent on reinforcing failure by sending more and more troops into Ukraine, into a situation where there is now a gathering cauldron. In other words, a gathering encirclement. And the fact that the city is now practically encircled has been confirmed at the most authoritative level by none other than Yevgeny Prigozhin. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the titular head of the Wagner organization, has now come out and said that Bakhmut is indeed in a state of virtual encirclement. And there's a TASS report about this, which I'm now going to read. And it says, its title is Artyomovsk, Bakhmut in other words, practically surrounded by Russian forces, says Wagner Group founder. And the body of the article reads as follows. Russian forces have practically surrounded Artyomovsk, Bakhmut. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the founder of the Wagner private military company, said in a video message to Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky on Friday. The two, Prigozhin and Zelensky, have a curious dialogue. Actually, dialogue is the wrong word because, to my knowledge, Zelensky has never addressed any words to Prigozhin. But Prigozhin, by contrast, now regularly sends to Zelensky public messages and statements, and, well, this is another one. And TASS now then provides us with extracts from it. The Wagner private military units have practically surrounded Bakhmut. Only one road is left, Prigozhin said in a video posted on his press service's Telegram channel. In his appeal to Zelensky, Prigozhin called for an unhindered exit for elders and children from Bakhmut. Previously, and these are his words, the professional Ukrainian army fought against us, whilst today we are seeing more and more elders and children. They are fighting, but their life near Bakhmut is short, only a day or two. Please give them a chance to leave the city. And the Wagner organization then backed these words of Prigozhin by publishing video footage which appears to show two Ukrainian citizens, two young men and an elderly man, asking Zelensky to allow them to return home to their families. And from what I can understand, these are actually Ukrainian soldiers, and it's been suggested that the two young people, the two young men, are actually extremely young, that they're teenagers, perhaps below the age of majority. Anyway, I haven't seen the video, so I don't want to comment on it, and I don't want to say how accurate it is or whether it might have been staged or something of that kind. But anyway, so that's Prigozhin. He tells us that Bakhmut is now practically surrounded. And elsewhere, I've read that Prigozhin has said that the Wagner organization troops are now within half a kilometer of the last remaining road into Bakhmut itself. And there appears to be now intense fighting going on in Ivanivka, one of the villages that's still being contested in the on the western side of Bakhmut, and of course it sits astride one of the roads. Now, to my understanding, that particular road has been unusable by Ukraine for quite a long time. The road that we're now told the Wagner organization is within half a kilometer of is a different road. But anyway, that there's fighting going on in Ivanivka, and the village is in the process of being stormed. And the fighting at the other road, the one Prigozhin is talking about, that is taking place at a place called Homovo. And as I said, it seems at least the Wagner organization is telling us, and they're usually pretty reliable about what they say, that they are now within half a kilometer distance of that road. Now, I will say straight away that half a kilometer distance is practically no distance at all. Obviously, this road, the Russians have had it within range of their artillery for quite a long time. In my program yesterday, and in a program I also did on the Duran, I mentioned, certainly in the program I did on the Duran, I mentioned that a NGO has been complaining that the this road that passes close to Homovo, which the Ukrainians have still been using, essentially became unusable from the 27th of February, and that the Russian forces are now able to use anti-tank guided missiles to knock out Ukrainian vehicles that pass along this road. And I pointed out that modern anti-tank guided missiles, well, I wasn't entirely sure what the range was, but that must bring them very close to the road indeed, if they're able to use these precision-guided, anti-tank guided missiles against vehicles on the road. Now, a number of people then wrote to me and provided me with a vast cascade of information about anti-tank guided missiles. They can apparently, their range, the range at which they can be operated varies between 3 kilometers and 10, it seems, perhaps some even further. But whatever it is, half a kilometer distance is well within distance of this road. The operators can certainly see everything that's going up and down this road. And I would have thought that at that sort of range, it is essentially unusable. So we are now, it seems to me, in a state definitely of effective encirclement. We've heard lots of information that the country lanes, the fields, are now becoming essentially impossible to use for heavy vehicles. So supplies to the garrison in Bakhmut is now becoming impossible. And in fact, there's now a cascade of reports suggesting that the situation for Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut itself is becoming incredibly difficult. Before I discuss that, note that Prigozhin gives the life expectancy of a Ukrainian soldier fighting in Bakhmut at around a day, which obviously is longer, a day or two to be precise, which is of course longer than the 4 hours that some other people have been saying. Perhaps this is a more plausible life expectancy, but it still makes grim reading when you hear about it. But regardless of that, it seems that there's been a major fallback of Ukrainian troops in and around, within Bakhmut itself. There was reports that another bridge inside Bakhmut, to the extent that I can understand it, has been blown up by the Ukrainian troops, presumably in an attempt to try and slow the Wagner organization advances. And it seems that they are now indeed within meters, 100 meters or so, of reaching the MiG-17 monument. At least that's what I've heard. There are contradictory claims about that, but anyway, whatever. The overall picture is clear enough. It's of Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut falling back. Quite plausibly, they're running out of ammunition, they're running out of supplies, more of them are being killed, more and more of them are getting wounded, and it's becoming very difficult, presumably, to sustain this resistance. And we're also now starting to get reports that the soldiers in Bakhmut themselves are now starting to demand that they be evacuated from Bakhmut, that the situation there is impossible, and that they're now starting to put pressure on the Ukrainian High Command. Very much has happened, by the way, in the last stages of the fighting in Mariupol, when the Ukrainian defenders had got themselves holed up at the Azovstal steelworks, that they're now starting to demand that they be evacuated, withdrawn from Bakhmut as soon as possible. And again, it's not entirely easy to assess these reports. Some of them may be disinformation, but I get the sense this time that they're probably correct. Now, I would say that one report, the one that I discussed in my previous video, you may remember that there was a Ukrainian officer, or actually officer come blogger as it turns out, apparently quite a well-known blogger. He goes by the name of Magwar, which would imply that he was Hungarian, but I believe he is not in fact Hungarian. Anyway, he, in a video piece from Bakhmut, said that he questioned the logic of Ukraine trying to hold on to Bakhmut for much longer. And he's now come and said that under the specific orders of General Syrskyi himself, that's to say the overall Ukrainian Ground Forces commander, his unit, just hours after he made that video address, his unit has now been ordered to pull out of Bakhmut. And, of course, Prigozhin said that it's no longer professional Ukrainian military that the Wagner organization is fighting against. It is elders and children. At least that's what Prigozhin says. So, it could be, it's just possible, that all those reinforcements we were hearing about that the Ukrainians were sending to Bakhmut, that they were basically there to cover a withdrawal from Bakhmut, and that this is really actually what is going on. Regardless of that, we'll see. But it's clear that the situation is now really at breaking point. I think that I've said previously that we were in the end game of the end game. It really does look as if the end of the Battle of Bakhmut may be just hours away. At least I hope so. And I want to say that again. There's been far too much life, so far too many lives wasted because of a, in my opinion, illogical and unsustainable defense of this town. It's made, whatever the military reasoning in trying to defend Bakhmut, which may have existed in the summer or in the early autumn, it's been clear for months that the position was ultimately an undefendable one, and that Ukraine was throwing away lives, thousands of lives, to no purpose by trying to, at least no purpose that I can understand, by to try to hold on to this undefendable place. And let me repeat again, at a simple humane calculus, throwing away lives in this profligate manner makes no sense to me and is morally questionable, to say the least. But I'm aware of all the military arguments that, or rather I should say rationalizations, that people cook up to explain why it was important for Ukraine to hold on to Bakhmut. But it seems to me that the overall effect for Ukraine of doing so was to lose thousands, probably tens of thousands of men. And as far as I can see, that has weakened the Ukrainian army. It has not strengthened it, especially given the enormous discrepancy in losses that there clearly have been between the Ukrainians and the Russians. I appreciate the Western media takes a different view, but that's clearly my understanding of the actual realities of the casualties in Bakhmut, and given also the fact that the human resources available to Russia are so much greater than Ukraine's. So it's made no sense to me from any point of view, whether you're talking about it as buying time or engaging in attrition against the Russians. It makes no sense to try to hold on to Bakhmut in the way that Ukraine has done. And of course, that has prolonged the battle. Of course, that has delayed the point when the Russians captured the town. But I cannot see that this has been a success for Ukraine. It seems to me that what it has done instead is reinforced and compounded failure. Anyway, that's what I get to say today about the situation in Bakhmut. Now, we're going to see what happens, whether there is indeed some kind of an attempt at an orderly withdrawal from Bakhmut. I have to say that it's going to be an extremely complicated affair now. If it does take place, I suspect that if most of these Ukrainian troops from Bakhmut are going to be extracted, there will have to be some kind of quiet understanding reached with the Russians to let them go. And one way of interpreting Prigozhin's message to Zelensky, the message in which he says that unhindered exit for elders and children from Bakhmut should be permitted. One way of interpreting this message is the Russians, in effect, telling the Ukrainian authorities, yes, we are prepared to let the remnants of your forces in Bakhmut leave. As far as we're concerned, we've achieved our main objective here in Bakhmut. We've dealt a massive blow to your army. We've inflicted huge casualties. It's clear now that the town is about to fall. So why don't you just take your troops out? Let us take over. We've achieved our objectives. It's time to end the chapter on this story. And if you want to evacuate your troops, such as they are, from Bakhmut, we're not going to stand in your way. So I have a feeling that that may be what the Russians, what Prigozhin is signaling. And of course, from his point of view, you can see the sense of that. As I said, we've had months of grinding attrition in Bakhmut. One or more days is not going to add to the totality of that to any significant extent. And of course, yes, more Ukrainian troops might be killed, including boys and older men, perhaps, if what Prigozhin says is true. But of course, in such a fight, some of his fighters, some of the Wagner organization fighters, would now be either wounded or killed if it was prolonged for an extra couple of hours or days. So why not complete the mission? Capture Bakhmut and let whatever Ukrainian troops are still there, just let them go. Well, we will see what decision the Ukrainian leadership makes. They've been extremely reluctant, very unwilling to face reality in Bakhmut up to this point. But perhaps events are now becoming overwhelming. And if it is indeed true that soldiers in Bakhmut itself and in the area around are starting to demand a withdrawal, perhaps this is the point where it will happen. We must wait and see. What I would say is that if all of these arrangements are made, then of course it means that the Russians have foregone the possibility of creating a cauldron around any additional Ukrainian troops west of Bakhmut. Perhaps that's not realistic. Perhaps the Russians have concluded that that's not realistic. And perhaps also, again, from a Russian point of view, the cost of trying to carry out such an envelopment is prohibitive given the gains that have already been achieved. I'm not a military person. I don't like to undertake these kind of cost-benefit calculations, which I'm sure military commanders, professional military commanders, make, but I wouldn't be surprised if that is a cost-benefit calculation that some of them are now making. Anyway, we will see. It does seem to me that the decision now has to be made by the trio of Zelensky, Zaluzhny, and Syrskyi, and we'll see what decision they come to between them. So probably we're almost at the end in Bakhmut. If not, by the way, then I suspect that the horror that we're going to see in the town itself, as it is finally cut off, the lock is sealed on the door, and these Ukrainian soldiers are left, the horror will be unimaginably worse, unless, of course, these soldiers have the good sense to ignore whatever orders they're getting from faraway Kiev and simply hand themselves in to the Russians. By the way, I would add, and this is just a quick additional point, that I've heard that some soldiers of the nationalist battalions, the highly politicized elite battalions, which, like Aidar presumably, which Ukraine rushed to try to hold the positions in Bakhmut, that they're now also demanding that the fight in Bakhmut be brought to an end and that they be allowed to withdraw. Anyway, that's the situation in Bakhmut. There's a lot going on other battlefronts too, and we had a very interesting article from Peter Beaumont in The Guardian about Kupiansk. Now, I've been saying for some time that the fighting appears to be, the Russians appear to be coming very close to Kupiansk. Peter Beaumont has been there. The article that he's written in The Guardian is dated 3rd of March, but I sense that he was there perhaps a day or so before. I mean, I'm not sure. But regardless, the very latest report I've seen is that the Russians have now broken through and are now literally on the outskirts of Kupiansk itself, that they're about 1 kilometer away, and that in fact fighting for the town, which is the most important town that Ukraine recaptured in its Kharkiv counteroffensive of the autumn, that fighting for Kupiansk is now about to start in earnest, with the Russians making a big effort to recapture this place. And there's more and more talk, of course, that the Ukrainians are pulling troops out of Kupiansk. Anyway, Peter Beaumont essentially confirms this, and he discusses in this article how it's been the back and forth in Kupiansk since the start of the war. On the 27th of February 2022, the Russians rolled in and captured Kupiansk, apparently without much of a fight. Kupiansk was then recaptured by Ukraine during the Kharkiv counteroffensive in September. And then Peter Beaumont, who, by the way, I should say, is a staunch supporter of Ukraine. Anyway, he now reports, now Kupiansk is under threat again. It has got much noisier in the last 2 weeks. Sometimes the whole house shakes. People are scared. Some people have evacuated recently because of the situation. And this is, Peter Beaumont is here quoting an eyewitness. And in fact, there's an awful lot about from various witnesses, people who are in Kupiansk. He says that you can hear the sound of shelling and that there's a rising sense of fear, though there remains what he calls a strange approximation of normal life in Kupiansk. And he talks about a school being open, and he then has brave words from the mayor of Kupiansk, Ukrainian appointed mayor, of course. The Russians, no doubt, have their own mayor. I'm not going to get into the politics of this. And the mayor says, I don't know what the Russians are trying, but we're standing our ground and remaining in our positions. What they're hitting is the civil infrastructure. And we can observe the dynamic that is happening. The shelling is increasing. There are more victims. So now we're focusing on evacuating children and people with disabilities. We'd hoped the threat would go away after the autumn, but Kupiansk can still be reached by artillery and grads, so we have to be smart and plan until the time comes when the front line is pushed away. Now that, of course, would lead you to think that the Russians are not on the outskirts of Kupiansk, but back to where the Ukrainians pushed them in the autumn. But of course, the reality is that Kupiansk is coming under increasing threat. And Peter Beaumont then crosses the Oskol River. He goes to the East Bank. Most of these interviews take place on the West Bank. And he says that the scene then changes. This is the area which is most closest to the Russian lines. He says, a railway hub with a large industrial area has come under frequent shelling. Kupiansk-Vuzlovsky's streets, this is the area east of the Oskol, are almost empty, save for soldiers and a few residents. Local people say less than a third of the population remains, and more are leaving every day. And it looks increasingly, therefore, as if the situation in Kupiansk is deteriorating. And as I said, this is a rather impressionistic account of the fighting in Kupiansk from a British journalist who, as I said, is very supportive of Ukraine. But it does corroborate, or appear to corroborate, Russian accounts. They are very close to Kupiansk again. They haven't yet attempted to storm the town, but it's increasingly looking as if they might be thinking of doing so. And elsewhere, we're now getting reports that there's been a major intensification of Russian attacks on Avdiivka. Now, this is this big town, or I say town, it's about 30,000 people. This place close to Donetsk city, which, as I've said before, is the hub of Ukrainian defenses in Donetsk city. Now, we're getting far less detail of what is actually going on in Kupiansk, in Avdiivka. We don't have the same useful reporters that we have in other places. We don't have people like Prigozhin, who gives us a running commentary of the Battle of Bakhmut. We don't have Alexander Hodorkovsky, the leader of the Vostok forces, who's present in Vuhledar, who admittedly gives us few reports, but when he does provide those reports, they're extremely informative. So it's more difficult to get a sense of what's going on. But maps I've seen, and these are essentially Ukrainian maps or pro-Ukrainian maps, they now show, again, a creeping encirclement, but perhaps that's a slight misnomer, because it's a creeping encirclement that is creeping forward now quite quickly of Avdiivka. And interestingly and importantly, we're hearing that Russian aircraft are now operating over Avdiivka, that the Avdiivka and the fortifications around Avdiivka are being bombed from the air. Now that is important because, as many have commented, up till fairly recently, the Russian Air Force has been relatively absent from the fighting because of the effectiveness of the Ukrainian air defense system, a legacy of the Soviet era. But it seems that the Russians now feel that this air defense system has been sufficiently degraded to allow their aircraft, their fixed-wing aircraft, to carry out bomb strikes on Ukrainian fortifications in Avdiivka. And based on material I've been provided by various private individuals who are well informed about these matters, I've explained why gravity bombs can do much more damage to fortified positions than artillery shelling can do. And it looks as if at the moment the aircraft that have been deployed to bomb Avdiivka are relatively light Sukhoi 25 ground attack aircraft, though they can carry quite a heavy bomb load. But perhaps before long we'll be seeing heavier aircraft, Sukhoi 30s and Sukhoi 34s operators as well. Of course, if the Russians feel confident and are able to deploy their very heavy bombers, their Tupolev 22M3s, which can carry extremely heavy gravity bombs, well, then the situation becomes even more difficult for the defenders. Anyway, it's difficult to know precisely what is going on in Avdiivka, but clearly the situation there is intensifying. It's getting more difficult for Ukraine. So, tough situation for Ukraine in Avdiivka, coming on top of the crisis in Bakhmut and the emerging crisis in Kupiansk. And I've discussed already my own opinion that in Vuhledar, Ukraine is making exactly the same mistake as it has made in Bakhmut. It has over-reinforced, it has committed itself, apparently, to holding out in Vuhledar for as long as possible. It's deployed more troops and more reinforcements there. It's made some very triumphant claims about Vuhledar, as it was doing some weeks ago, by the way, about Bakhmut. I mean, there was all those reports, you may remember, about Ukrainian soldiers heroically defeating Russian human wave attacks. I've said that the whole concept of human waves has no relevance at all to this war and is a complete error. But anyway, and has not been used by either side in launching attacks over the course of this war. But anyway, there was a lot of reports from Ukraine about the success of Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut, and I've noticed what seems to me disturbingly like the same claims, propaganda if you prefer, now being circulated about Vuhledar. And that's, of course, found its way into the Western media. I was reading, for example, in the Daily Telegraph about a successful Ukrainian counterattacks near Vuhledar, about whole regiments, it seemed, of the Russian army having been destroyed in and around Vuhledar, none of which, by the way, I think is true. The only part of that report that made sense to me and which I could relate to the actual reports I'm getting of the fighting near Vuhledar is that Ukraine has laid quite a lot of mines in this area, and these have been difficult. These have presented problems for the Russians as they try to tighten their grip on Vuhledar. But I suspect that before very long we're going to find that Vuhledar is going to become the same kind of meat grinder for Ukraine that Bakhmut has been, though hopefully not on the same scale. And I think now we're beginning to get a sense of Russian tactics in this war. And these two, it must be said, follow a pretty brutal calculus, but it's a calculus which at least protects, or if you like, not perhaps protects, husbands Russian resources. It's not profligate in Russian lives and in terms of Russian material. And of course, it is fully consistent with the statements that Russian officials have made. People like the defense ministers, Sergei Shoigu, the chief of the general staff, Valery Gerasimov, who is now the overall commander of the forces in fighting in Ukraine, and of course General Surovikin, who is his deputy, was previously the predecessor as overall commander, and who I suspect remains the theatre commander in the fighting. All of them have spoken about the Russians grinding Ukraine down. And it seems to me that this is exactly what the Russians are doing. And if you take a step back and think about the way Russians conduct operations, it is consistent with this. If we go back to the summer, to the period directly following the fall of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, I remember there was a lot of debate about where the Russians would strike the next blow. And there was a lot of discussions. Dima on the military summary channel gave a particularly good and cogent discussion, suggesting that the most logical place for the Russians to attack was Seversk. This is a town to the west of Lysychansk, fairly small place, on the face of it rather more vulnerable than Bakhmut, an easier place to capture, and of course it stood at the northern end of the Zelensky line. And for a while, it did look as if that would be where the Russians would land their main blow, that they would go for Seversk. And there were even claims, briefly, over the course of August, made twice, that Seversk had actually been captured by the Russians, which claims, by the way, which turned out to be untrue. Instead, the Russians focused on Bakhmut, the most heavily fortified part of the line, but the most important part from Ukraine's point of view, the part Ukraine was obliged to defend if the Zelensky line was to hold. And the Russians went about this attack on Bakhmut in a very careful, incremental way. They essentially conducted siege war against it. They didn't try to storm the town. They didn't deploy, tens of thousands of troops in advance, overwhelming Ukrainian defenses to storm Bakhmut. Something which perhaps in the summer they didn't have the resources to do, but which presumably they do have now, but they've never actually done that. What they did instead was that they attacked Bakhmut incrementally and attritionally, knowing that it was a place which Ukraine would have to defend if it was to preserve its hold over Donbass and to maintain the integrity of its main defense line, the Zelensky line. So the result was that Ukraine poured reinforcements into Bakhmut over a period of many months, and the Russians, with their enormous artillery advantage, were able to grind those Ukrainian defenses down. And they did that by attacking. They did that destroying a very large proportion of the Ukrainian army by, in effect, attacking Ukraine at what may very well have been its strongest point, or at least the point that was the linchpin of its defences. And it seems to me that they're doing exactly the same now. For example, in Vuhledar, Vuhledar is as much of a linchpin for Ukrainian defences in Donbass, southern Donbass, as Bakhmut was in central and northern Donbass. And the Russians have also operated their cruise missile offensive against Ukraine in the same way. Now, like many people, like virtually everybody, I assumed at the start of the campaign that it was intended to knock out the Ukrainian energy system. Though I went along with the view, I adopted the view that John Helmer at Dancing with Bears did, expressed that the Russians weren't intent on carrying out a knockout blow over the entire Ukrainian energy system. They were rather attacking it steadily to find out how it worked, establish its strong points and its weak points, degrade it, and then eventually, when the big offensive came, they would know how to knock it down, and that's, of course, what they would eventually do. And I still believe that there is a large element of truth to that. I still think that is at least part of the thinking behind the Russian attack on the energy system. But there is another aspect to it, and I think that's become increasingly obvious over the last few weeks, was that again, the Russians were attacking Ukraine's energy system. In other words, something that Ukraine had no option but to defend. And the result is that Ukraine has defended its energy system, and it's expended, apparently, the bulk of its S-300 air defense missiles doing so. And the result has been that the Russians have gradually depleted Ukraine's air defenses, found out how the air defense system works, and that is why they're now able to operate aircraft over places like Avdiivka. So we get, I think, an accumulating sense of Russian attrition strategy. Now, the Russians continue with this. Obviously, the West is going to supply weapons. We hear that the Ukrainian troops who are being trained on the Patriot system that the United States has promised to supply have now been trained to use it. It will be deployed, no doubt, in Ukraine at some point. Nobody seems to know quite when. But it's only one system. Germany and the Netherlands are going to provide one more each. There's only a limited number of missiles. The Russians have said that they will destroy these Patriot systems like they've destroyed so many other Ukrainian air defense systems. And it seems to me that they can absorb and carry through its destruction in exactly the same way that they've destroyed and absorbed and depleted and degraded so much more of Ukraine's air defense system up to now. So I think that obviously this is my own view and my own assessment, but we can see how attrition works and how the Russians are conducting attrition at every level. And of course they do have tactical objectives. I do think they do intend to capture Kupiansk. I do think they intend to capture Vuhledar and eventually Avdiivka. But the more resources Ukraine commits to defending these places, which are linchpins of the Ukrainian defense system, the more it falls in with Russia's attrition strategy, which the Russians can conduct because of their enormous advantage in artillery and munitions. Now, that, it seems to me, is my own summary of the state of the battlefields. Now, I do want to return to that really very unpleasant incident that happened yesterday, when there was an incursion by a group of, shall we call them saboteurs, into Bryansk region. Now, I'm going to say straight away that as far as I'm concerned, this operation fulfills all the criteria of a terrorist attack. As far as I can see, what happened, and reports are extremely sketchy, what happened was that two small groups of troops, around 80 men in total, infiltrated the Russian border and struck towards two villages. There's no information or suggestion that either of these villages contain any conceivable military targets or had any strategic significance at all. So this was clearly an attack directed at what might be called soft targets. Now, what happened next is difficult to establish precisely, but it does seem clear that a civilian car was shot at, a man was killed, a child was injured but survived, and there does seem to have been another incident in which someone else, another civilian, was killed. And there's been a lot of reports in the Russian media about a boy called Fyodor, who apparently went to the rescue of other children. It's not clear to me exactly what happened, but he appears to have been wounded also, though he also survived. Now, this does look very much like an attack on a soft target. Within a short time, the Russians sent security forces to this area, and what happened next is very difficult indeed to establish precisely. But it does look as if this group of Ukrainian soldiers managed to leave Russian territory and cross back to Ukraine. Now, it could be, and I've seen some suggestions, that they just fled, that when they heard the Russian troops were on their way, they just themselves ran away. Up to that point, they had posed for the camera with various flags, made all kinds of statements near various civilian facilities in these two villages, one of these two villages. But it seems possible, at least, that they weren't intending to make any kind of fight of it. They terrorized the local people, frightened the local people. Two civilians, as I said, were killed. A number of others, including some miners, were injured. But then, as I said, they weren't up for a firefight, and they fled. There is an alternative view, and this has not been confirmed, which is that they were able to flee because they took hostages. And the suggestion is that they took 6 hostages, and it's not clear at all whether this is the case or not, but a statement from the Russian authorities that these people were allowed to go to Ukrainian territory, were squeezed into Ukrainian territory, and that this was done in order to save civilians rather than to engage these people in out-and-out battle. Anyway, that Russian statement suggests to me that there might indeed have been hostages taken. Now, I don't know this for a fact, but it's one possible interpretation of events. And if that's correct, then presumably those hostages were released when the Ukrainians crossed back into their own territory, because there's no suggestion so far that they kidnapped any Russians and brought them with them to Ukraine. Now, if hostages were taken, then that compounds the horror of this story. As I said, an attack on a village, 2 villages, or 2 undefended villages, killing of civilians, possibly taking of hostages. I find the whole episode deeply shocking, and I would like to believe that people would condemn it. Though, of course, in the West, they are not doing so. And what makes this whole situation worse is, again, this elaborate cover that the Ukrainian army itself was not involved in some way, that these were Russian partisans or dissidents taking up arms against Putin. The statement that's been published is full of all of that sort of thing. And some of the soldiers involved do indeed originate from Russia, though they don't seem to have lived there for quite a long time. 3 of them have been identified, and they have all been identified as individuals who have far-right political views of a sort that one would associate with a certain ideology that was very widespread in Central Europe in the middle of the 20th century. And by the way, all 3 of them go by nicknames which associate them even further, identify them even further with that ideology. I find that sort of a troubling, shocking, horrible affair, and I think that it does absolutely no credit to the Ukrainian leadership, who undoubtedly were behind it. And let me repeat again, as far as I'm concerned, it fulfills all the criteria for a terrorist act. Now, I say all of that, we'll get much more information, no doubt, eventually about this incident. The Russians are keeping very quiet about it, obviously because they don't want to, if these people did flee and took hostages, they don't want to perhaps, the Russians themselves perhaps don't want to publicize the fact. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about that incident. Now, there's a number of other things I do want to touch on fairly quickly. The first is that we've now seen President Lukashenko's aircraft returning to Belarus, and the Russians, perhaps in order to make clear once and for all that their A-50U AWACS aircraft in Belarus is in full operating condition. They arranged for it to accompany President Lukashenko's jet as it flew back into Minsk. So I think that story, as I said, is fully buried. There's been some really rather interesting, however, diplomatic events. Firstly, we are having a lead up to another meeting of the G20, and the G20 this time is chaired by India, and the Indians chaired a meeting of G20 finance ministers and then a meeting of G20 foreign ministers. And the Western powers put relentless pressure over the course of both meetings for statements to be published by the G20 condemning Russia for the war in Ukraine. Now, it is inconceivable that the Western powers thought that the Russians, who are members of the G20, would ever sign up to such condemnations. And obviously they didn't. And maybe the G20 hoped that the Russians would be isolated. But of course, China also pushed back and also refused to sign off on any communiques. So the result is that both the finance ministers' meeting and the foreign ministers' meeting broke up without any final communique being published. A statement was published by the foreign ministers the remaining foreign ministers, other than China and Russia. India signed off on the statement. They wanted some kind of a statement issued, but it doesn't appear to condemn Russia in any particular way. It repeats the words of the UN General Assembly resolution about Russia needing to withdraw its forces unconditionally from Ukraine. Now, I get the impression that the Indians have been extremely upset and angered by this whole affair, by the way in which the Western powers have tried to hijack the G20 for their geopolitical feud with the Russians. And Prime Minister Modi of India has, to some extent, I think, been humiliated by what happened. He decided that he would not attend the foreign ministers' meeting, or even address it, apparently. And that has to be because he understood the extent of the divisions, and he's now coming on under intense criticism in India. MS Badrakumar, very perceptive Indian commentator, former diplomat, has written about this. He says that neither of these two meetings could produce a joint communique, and the reason for the failure is the inability of the host country to knock the heads together and persuade them to enter a consensual corridor. The Western countries are by far overrepresented in the G20 and overreached in their dogged determination to pillory and ostracize two major emerging powers, Russia and China, and the latter couldn't take bullying anymore and understandably pushed back. And he goes on to say the root problem is the militarized American leadership, and he talks about the fact that the United States doesn't seem to be willing to seek any kind of accommodation on any kind of issue, doesn't seem to be prepared to compromise. Apparently several countries, finance ministers of several countries, including the Indian finance minister, said at the G20 finance ministers meeting that a meeting of finance ministers wasn't really anyway an appropriate venue to discuss a question like Ukraine, but the Americans and their friends simply went on like the proverbial bull in a china shop and smashed all the pieces around. And Badrakumar, and I'm sure there are others in India who are doing the same, blamed Modi. They said that he's been far too accommodating to the Western powers. He's trying to play this complicated game of trying to keep the Russians and the Western powers happy, and that the result is he finds himself in a position where India was in effect humiliated at these two meetings. I'm going to take the unusual step of pushing back against Badrakumar. I think that as far as the Russians are concerned, the Russians are very understanding of India's problems, and I think the Indians probably handled this very difficult situation as well as they could possibly do. I think it does not make sense for India simply to take sides in the way that some people would like it to do, both from the West and from the other side. I think its present ambiguous position, appearing at times to go along with some of the things that the West wants, whilst at the same time preserving its relationship with Russia, not only serves Indian interests, but actually, from a Russian point of view, is as good as they can reasonably expect, and that they understand that, and that they are satisfied with it. I've noticed that Russian commentaries, including one from the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, do not criticize India at all. Indeed, they speak instead rather sympathetically about India's position. So I just wanted to say that because, as I said, I do know that Modi and his foreign minister have come in for some criticism over what's happened at these G20 meetings. The second thing I would say about these G20 meetings is that at the foreign ministers' meeting, there was a brief meeting between Blinken and Lavrov, and it's very difficult to understand what the purpose of that meeting was. Apparently, Blinken asked for this meeting with Lavrov, and supposedly it was to express concerns about the Russian decision to suspend the New START treaty, something which I'm also concerned about, by the way, as I made clear in previous programs. But typically, Blinken came up with nothing. And this meeting, which was arranged literally just moments before it happened, and was just this physical meeting between these two men, which only lasted apparently a short time, doesn't appear to have produced anything new. And that begs the question of why did that meeting happen? I suspect the reason is that there's now a great deal of pressure now building up in the West to initiate some sort of discussions with the Russians about Ukraine. There is a widespread understanding that I think the situation in Ukraine isn't going at all well, and that things are going badly wrong, and that some kind of outreach to the Russians needs to take place. There's been a really very interesting article in Politico, which perhaps conveys a sense of this. It says, Biden's triumphant visit to Kiev gives way to a sober war reality. And it goes on to say the war, the pageantry and defiance of the president's covert trip masks what is an increasingly bloody, difficult end to the war. And then it goes on through the article to tell us that things have not been going especially well in the war, that there's now increasing tensions within the Western alliance. It claims that Blinken even had a meeting with some of the leaders of the East European states and told them straightforwardly that they had to acknowledge the reality that the war would not end in regime change in Russia, and that this is no longer the US's objective. And it accepts that on the battlefronts, a renewed and brutal Russian offensive is making incremental progress along the front. And it's a curious article in some ways, but anyway, it gives a sense of a bleak picture, and it appears to also acknowledge the need at some point for negotiations. There have to be some kind of negotiations to end the war. And we have a comment from Brett Bruin, a former State Department official in the Obama administration. We still need a strategy. Where are we going to be a year from now? I don't think that Biden or anyone on his team has articulated that. We're past days of dancing around the sensitivities of one country or one political leader. We have to either give Ukraine what it is going to take to win, which, as we know, isn't realistic, or we need to rethink the game plan. And as I said, I suspect that behind the scenes, pressure for some kind of opening to the Russians is intensifying. And that event goes on to say that even a vote of frozen conflict, one that weakens Ukraine and the West, would be perceived as a partial win for Putin, Western officials believe. And most intelligent analysts on both sides of the Atlantic believe the war as currently fought could stretch for years, while that would end up draining each nation's military and economy. The Biden administration has begun to loudly sound the alarm that Moscow may soon have help on the way, and then he talks about China and all of those concerns too. So pressure on Blinken to meet and to start some kind of negotiations with Lavrov. And maybe that's why Blinken met Lavrov at the G20. Well, nothing came of it. Blinken came up with no ideas. And of course, anybody expecting Blinken to come up with ideas is deluding themselves. I think the purpose of the meeting, from Blinken's point of view, is not to actually initiate talks with the Russians. I don't think he has any interest in that. I think it is, on the contrary, to go through the motions, suggest that he's doing what he can, that he's actually having meetings with Lavrov, and that it's Lavrov who is coming away uninterested in substantive discussions. So I think that was the point of that meeting was, but it is suggestive, as I said, that the pressures may be building up behind the scenes. And then we have an even more interesting meeting. And this is perhaps the most curious meeting of all. And this is Olaf Scholz is now on his way to Washington. Only the second time he's been to Washington since he became Chancellor, by the way. Last time he was there was in January last year. And of course, that was the time when Biden, in his presence, bragged that he would make sure that Nord Stream pipelines didn't operate. But anyway, that's for another day. Anyway, the interesting thing about Scholz's visit is that he's going to Washington unaccompanied by any member of the German media, unaccompanied by a German business delegation. Both of these are routine when the German Chancellor travels to Washington. And apparently there is not going to be a press conference. And can I thank a German correspondent for pointing this all out and referencing me to the sections of the German media where all this is being reported. Well, why is this the case? Why are we having this meeting in not exactly secrecy, but in this very furtive fashion? Well, the simple answer is, of course, that Scholz doesn't want to risk a press conference in which he and Biden might be asked difficult questions about the Nord Stream attacks and about the future course of the war in Ukraine. When meetings take place like this and the media is kept away, even the servile and compliant media that we've increasingly seen, that's a sign that there are growing differences, even if all the pretense is that everybody stands together and is united together in the same camp. And one wonders what those differences are. Perhaps Scholz is going to ask Biden some questions about Nord Stream, though I'm skeptical about that. It seems to me, once more, Scholz is going to come to Washington and is going to tell Biden, look, we've got to find some kind of off-ramp to end this war. It's not going well. It's not going well in Germany. German public opinion is turning. We can't keep this going indefinitely for much longer. And by the way, in advance of Scholz's visit, we've had German officials all but admit that all those decisions made a year ago to increase defence spending in Germany are having to be put off because Germany is facing a growing budget crisis. Well, there we go. Diplomacy at the moment, which is leading nowhere, and I think will continue to lead nowhere, at least for the time being. Pressure from all sorts of quarters to end the war, but the man in the Oval Office doesn't, I think, want to listen, and nor do the team around him. They're hunkering down. They're beginning to look like they're withdrawing into a kind of White House bunker. And they're still pressing forward with supplying weapons to Ukraine. Though I understand the next armed package is going to be only $400 million. Only $400 million, but that's little compared to what we've seen up to now, increasingly suggesting that the cupboard is indeed becoming bare. Anyway, that's where we are today. Obviously, lots going on the battlefronts. We'll see what happens in Bakhmut over the next couple of hours. That's the focus of attention at the moment. All this diplomacy that's going on, be clear about this, it is related to the events in Bakhmut. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. And can I just say, you can find all our videos, Duran videos, my videos, on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. And you can also go to our shop, buy the great things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for the day. More from me soon. Thank you again and have a very good day.